Okay. Well, good morning again, everybody. I normally steer away, both in my life and in these talks, from the news. I don't read newspapers and find it's mostly gossip and chit-chat and stuff that is of not great consequence, but unfortunately what's going on in the news right now is of great consequence. There's some very difficult stuff going on. So I'm going to talk about what's going on in Israel, Palestine and the Middle East today, and I'm going to do so intentionally from a Dharma perspective, so I'm not going to get into politics or taking sides, right? But I'm going to talk about it from a Dharma perspective. I'm going to do so using stories, conversations I've had and relating stories. The framework that I'd ask you to use as you listen to this is something that Ben Connolly wrote, who's a Zen teacher out of Minnesota. He wrote a book on this, and he came down here a year ago maybe and led a retreat based on this teaching. It's Vasubandhu's Three Natures. Vasubandhu's Three Natures are the three natures of reality. They are the imaginary nature, the dependent nature, and the fully realized nature. So let me explain the framework I'm asking you all to use here. The imaginary nature is, it's all stories. We think we know stuff, but we don't. We just flat out don't. And if we peel it apart, we realize it's not what we think it is. It's a story, it's not reality. This here, I think this is a gareth. I think this is something really special and really unique, and it's like permanent, and it's a gareth. It's stardust. And the physical matter is all stardust. Literally, I mean, it's exploded stars coalesce and over time forms this. And it's constantly changing. Constantly changing. And the consciousness that I think is my consciousness, well, on the one level, it's hand consciousness and foot consciousness, all these different sense touch consciousnesses, and vision, eye consciousness, so it's fragmented. But it's also not separate from other consciousness. So it's part of this broader awareness that all of our awareness touches and actually really is in the greatest sense. So the first is the imaginary nature of reality, that it's not what we think it is, it's all stories. The second is the dependent nature, which is also underneath what I was just saying. We're all connected. Everything is connected. Nothing exists independently. Everything exists because other things exist. Basic teaching, because this comes to be, that comes to be. Because this ceases to be, that ceases to be. Because this is, that is. Because this is not, that is not. This is dependence, both over time, because this comes to be, and in the present moment. It's both happens over time and in the present moment instantaneously. It's incredibly complicated. So it's just dependent nature. And then the fully realized nature, this is reality. Nirvana is samsara. It's the same thing, but it's seen radically differently. So the fully realized nature is to wake up to the truths that I've just described and know them in your bones. No, there is no such thing as a gareth. There really is no such thing as a gareth. And yet, there is this awareness that shows up, does experience suffering, and sees the suffering of the world. And what does it do with that? So this is our fully realized nature and where we'll end up. So what do we do with this? Okay, so the stories, and I'm going to start, the stories at the beginning are really going to be those first two. It's kind of hard to pass them out really, but I'll leave you to figure some of that out. I may offer some helpful thoughts, but I'll leave you to figure that out. Story one. So I've a Jewish friend of mine who is the executive director of a reasonably sizable non-profit, or a real non-profit. It's not like 3 people. I mean, it's like a real budget, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So she's the executive director of a non-profit here in town. She's a wonderful human being. Her partner is Jewish. Her family is Jewish. She's got family in Israel. She's very active in her temple. So she's, face value, she's a very active, engaged Jewish person. Her heart is one of universal compassion. That's the non-profit she's engaged in, is without boundaries. It's just universal love, universal compassion. So there is a regular interfaith group that I often participate in on a Wednesday lunchtime, which is people coming together for just a grounding in the middle of the week, half an hour of grounding. So somebody will say a few words, and then we'll meditate and then have a conversation. After the first part, the conversation piece, this person said, I joined today because there's something I really want to be able to say, and I can't say it in my community, in my Jewish community. And it's the extent to which my heart is breaking for the suffering of all the innocents. Yes, the invasion of Israel, the terrorist attacks, the hostage taking, the brutality, the murders, the pains, it's awful. But what has been going on within Palestinian territories is also awful, and what is happening now is grotesque, and what is going to happen is grotesque. And my heart breaks for all of the innocent people who are going to be suffering there. So that's all she wanted to say. And she said, but I can't say this in synagogue, I can't say this in Jewish community, because we become so polarized. There's another Jewish person on that call. It's just a small group, there were about 10 of us, so he was the only other Jewish person on the call. He's also a really lovely person. He's a very dear friend of mine. I've known him for many, many years. He does wonderful stuff in the community, and he's just a beautiful human being, also very active with his temple and his particular community. And in not a hostile way, he reacted and he said, yes, I hear that, but, and then started taking the side. The Israeli people are the offended people, so of course they have to respond, and of course there's going to be casualties, and of course. And if you were in Israel and if you understood, and the other person let that run its course, and then said, I understand. I really do understand, and trust me, I really understand. I've been to Israel many times. I have family who live in Israel. I have friends, dear friends. I know this. But it doesn't stop my heart breaking for all the innocents. Second story. This is another interfaith group that I hang out with, a Friday evening group. This is another small group. It's well, many of you met him at the installation we had here. Kamal Kurucu is a very dear friend of mine. He's with a Turkish Muslim community in Alpharetta. So every Friday he has a group, he leads a group that meets up there, and I often go up there. And it's just another small group. So we were meeting up there. One of the people who regularly attends, also a very dear friend of mine, she is married to a Palestinian gentleman, both Muslims. And the conversation, of course, drifts to what I'm talking about right now. And she said, I really wish Biden would check his facts before he talks. Because he at one point said he had personal evidence. He had seen beheadings and slaughter of Israeli children, and then within 48 hours he was walking that back because he hadn't. Somebody who he thought he could trust had told him that, and he realized it wasn't factually true, so he had to walk it back. So of course this was particularly difficult for somebody married to a Palestinian when the accusation is his people are beheading innocent children. So she said, I wish he'd check his facts. And the conversation spanned for just a couple of minutes, and then she said, I can't vote for Biden next year. And before she'd finished the sentence, the other people in the room had also said, I can't vote for Biden next year. Now, I'm not getting political about this at all. The reason I bring that up is because if you look at the group of people who are in that room, and I know these people really well, two of them work for social justice organizations and have done for many years, which are strongly opposed to Trump's agenda and the current Republican agenda. So there's no way they could support that. And they will vote anybody, they'll vote a dog into office to oppose that. So for her to say, and the other people to say, I can't vote for Biden, is an incredibly strong statement. And it's a statement about stories. Because what we have here is two levels of story. One is there is all of us listening to the stories that come out from the press and the politicians and the sources of information. But then behind that, there's this set of stories going on behind the curtain where Biden heard his stories and thought they were strong enough stories for him to communicate as fact, and then realized that that fabric of stories was also a tissue. So this is not saying there's no atrocities. There absolutely are atrocities. This is not saying Palestinians haven't done grotesque things. There are Palestinians who have done grotesque things. What this is simply saying is, when we hear these stories, we need to recognize they are stories and be very careful with them. Be very careful with them. Third story. This is, I had breakfast with my son the other day, and after wallowing through lots of morasses, his job search and his music and life, the universe and everything, we got onto this kind of agenda, and he, as he does, he'd be a really, really, really good lawyer because his research skills are amazing. His research brain, his logical brain and his research are just amazing. So he said, I've done a little bit of reading about this, and this is stuff that I vaguely knew, I'd come across before, but I'd basically forgotten. So humour me here, because this too is a story, and now I'm telling you a story that I have assembled. So please respect this with the same level of disrespect that you would respect all the other stories, because it is just my story, and I'm not pretending it is factually correct or balanced or any of those things. But I think there's enough in here, I really do believe there's enough in here to make another really important point. So after the First World War, or during the First World War, the British, at the time when the sun never set on the British Empire, I had a globe when I was a kid, and there was pink all over the darn place. It's just like the sun never set on this monster. So the British promised Arab leadership that if they would help kick the Ottoman Empire out, they'd be given their freedom. Meantime, the British Foreign Secretary, whose name I believe was Sykes, was having conversations with the French Foreign Secretary, whose name I believe was Picot, and sometime after the First World War we had the Sykes-Picot Agreement come into effect, which is the agreement that petitioned the whole of the Middle East between France and Great Britain. And the Arabs said, what the heck? And there was some unrest. And so, the Saud, among other things, the Saud family was put in place as a puppet royal family in Saudi Arabia, which wasn't Saudi Arabia until that point in time. Then we rolled the trucks forward, we come through the Second World War, right? And the Second World War was a great distribution of empire from Europe to America. So, as part of the price for getting American help in the Second World War, Britain basically stepped back from its empire and relinquished it to America. So there's the whole Suez thing. And then the British mandate was relinquished, I believe, in 1948. The Jewish state was created, and the Palestinian people were left as a nation without a country. This was all the result of this Western delineation and political machination. And then, as most of you are painfully aware, the Middle East became the home of oil, which became an increasingly important commodity, and so we've had the subsequent history of American-led, because America's, it's the way the world unfolded, involvement in the Middle East, which is political, economic, and military, oscillating between all three of those. So I say this not to take sides in any of this, not to take sides at all, but rather to simply point out we are all part of this. We can't separate ourselves from this. This is dependent arising. It's the very nature of dependent arising. It is really complicated. My facts may be off in places. There may be things which I've left out which are important. But there's an arc there, which is the important part here, which is the arc of the complexity of our global society in the 20th century that we can't get out of, and we are implicated in this thing. There's another piece of this that takes us back to story and is also, tied to this dependent arising point. We are focused on this particular very toxic and very important set of issues in the Middle East. We've kind of taken our eyes off another very important set of issues going on in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine and Russia. Kind of taken our eyes off of that for now. If we bring our eyes back to that, maybe somewhere along the way we'll remember that there is basically the best part of a civil war going on in Syria. That if we go to, even closer to home, Mexico, it's a disaster. There are wars going on in Mexico all the time. Venezuela has been a mess for a decade, just fallen at various degrees of falling apart. Haiti has been destroyed several times, most recently within the last couple of years for the umpteenth time. And then we go to the continent of Africa, and we've got Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is just an ongoing bloodbath. You've got Mali, which is an ongoing bloodbath. You've got a civil war in the Republic of I think it's the Republic of Central America. I haven't looked at South Africa and Zimbabwe in a long time, but those are both nations that had an awful lot of political turmoil. And then you've got Somalia, for crying out loud. So we're focusing on these two areas. We've shifted attention from one to the other, one group of white folks to another group of white folks. And we're ignoring all the people of colour in these civil wars around the world. Again, a lot of the story is the story we don't see. It's all part of the way we frame the imaginary nature. By focusing on particular elements, we're missing so much of the reality of existence, which is, just being, we can't focus on one thing to the exclusion of all others. Imaginary nature, dependent arising. So, what a mess, right? Fully realized nature. The fully realized nature is to begin to wake up to the truth of the complexity of this and non-ability to separate ourselves from this, and really let our views come down, really open up and not be taking views, taking sides in this. Just be opening ourselves up to the reality of the suffering. Just the reality of the suffering. That requires slowing down. The most important thing we do is slow down. There's a distinction that I've come across, which I think is a very useful one, between reaction and response. Now, we can get into semantics and you could switch the words, but there's a distinction between two things that I'm going to use those words to draw. Reaction is most of what's going on in the stories I've just talked about, in the world I've just talked about, which is we see something going on out there and it challenges our sense of identity, our sense of how the world should be, our sense of what we want to happen in some way where we want to preserve our identity, we want to preserve our ego, we want to make a particular change out there, we want to push things in a particular direction. It's agenda-driven, it's ego-driven, it's reactive. It's reactive. It's coming from what's in here that I identify with as me. Response and you were all sitting here for a while, and as we settle down, that me starts to fade a little bit. Maybe not totally, but hopefully you all have little glimpses in there where there's less me on the cushion. And when there's less me and something lands, there's not the same tightening and defensive response. There's a response out of an open heart. And I used the same word twice by accident there, but it's not the same tightening and reaction out of a closed heart, a reaction out of ego. Out of the settled place, there's a more open heart, and so the suffering can land within that open heart, and it can be received by what is really deep. And there's a response, we can say from the unconscious, we can say from Buddha nature, we can say from our true nature, but there's a response which is not an ego-driven response. It's not a directed response. It's a response of compassion and love. So in this fully realized nature, the first thing is to be settled and be stable, so that our responses are responses from the heart of compassion, not reactions from our ego. And to accomplish that, a lot of this is slowing down. If we're in a place where something comes up and we immediately react, it is a reaction. And if we pause, we can see that. And if we start to feel a reaction rising, oh, let me slow this down. Let me just take a couple of breaths. That may be the right thing, but if I'm letting it happen that way, that's not something I can trust. Let me slow it down enough that I can really let what is natural. Nisargadatta, one of my favorite teachers, means the natural state. And the natural state is this Buddha nature, it's this unconscious, it's this response out of pure compassion. So there are no easy answers here. 2,500 years ago, the guy who's sitting up there wandered around northern India with a profound teaching about release from suffering. And we are all here today because in varying degrees we believe that truth. We believe that's possible. But here we are 2,500 years later, there's a lot of suffering. We're not going to fix this today. There are no easy answers. But if we react, we are at risk of actually making things worse. At the very least we're perpetuating, but we're actually likely to make things worse if we react. If we settle down and respond from our hearts, from our true hearts, then it is a response of love. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can drive out darkness. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can drive out hate." And he was paraphrasing the Buddha, who said exactly the same thing 2,500 years ago in the Dhammapada. So it's to really, where I'm going to leave you is slow things down, and when you're slowed down and you know you're responding from a place of love, and you can trust that, then you can trust that to take you into whatever response you do. It could be calling a couple of friends or sending some emails to Israeli buddies you've got. It could be going out and walking down the streets. It could be flying to the Middle East to help some UN agency. Only you will know that for yourself. But settle down and let it come from the heart before you do anything.